Chapter 3. The Testimony of the Monks. Following the above-related occurrence, two of the brothers who had previously desired to visit the haunted castle again applied to the abbot for this permission, saying that God would surely aid them in their avenging the abduction of Theophil's body, as well as the taking of many others from consecrated ground. Marveling at the hardihood of these lusty monks, who proposed to beard the arch-enemy in his lair, the abbot permitted them to go forth, furnished with aspergillums and flasks of holy water, and bearing great crosses of hornbeam, such as would have served for maces with which to brain an armored knight. The monks, whose names were Bernard and Stephan, went boldly up at middle forenoon to assail the evil stronghold. It was an arduous climb, among overhanging boulders and along slippery scarps, but both were stout and agile, and, moreover, well accustomed to such climbing. Since the day was sultry and airless, their white robes were soon stained with sweat, but pausing only for brief prayer, they pressed on, and in good season they neared the castle, upon whose grey, time-eroded ramparts they could still descry no evidence of occupation or activity. The deep moat that had once surrounded the place was now dry, and had been partly filled by crumbling earth and detritus from the walls. The drawbridge had rotted away, but the blocks of the barbican, collapsing into the moat, had made a sort of rough causey on which it was possible to cross. Not without trepidation, and lifting their crucifixes as warriors lift their weapons in the escalade of an armed fortress, the brothers climbed over the ruin of the barbican into the courtyard. This, too, like the battlements, was seemingly deserted. Overgrown nettles, rank grasses, and sapling trees were rooted between its paving stones. The high, massive donjon, the chapel, and that portion of the castellated structure containing the great hall had preserved their main outlines after centuries of dilapidation. To the left of the broad bailey, a doorway yawned like the mouth of a dark cavern in the cliffy mass of the hall building, and from this doorway there issued a thin, bluish vapor, writhing in phantom coils toward the unclouded heavens. Approaching the doorway, the brothers beheld a gleaming of red fires within, like the eyes of dragons blinking through infernal murk. They felt sure that the place was an outpost of Erebus, an antechamber of the pit. But nevertheless they entered bravely, chanting loud exorcisms and brandishing their mighty crosses of hornbeam. Passing through the cavernous doorway, they could see but indistinctly in the gloom, being somewhat blinded by the summer sunlight they had left. Then, with the gradual clearing of their vision, a monstrous scene was limned before them, with ever-growing details of crowding horror and grotesquerie. Some of these details were obscure and mysteriously terrifying. Others, all too plain, were branded as if with sudden, ineffaceable hellfire on the minds of the monks. They stood on the threshold of a colossal chamber, which seemed to have been made by the tearing down of upper floors and inner partitions adjacent to the castle hall, itself a room of huge extent. The chamber seemed to recede through interminable shadow, shafted with sunlight falling through the rents of ruin, sunlight that was powerless to dissipate the infernal gloom and mystery. The monks averred, later, that they saw many people moving about the place, together with sundry demons, some of whom were shadowy and gigantic, and others barely to be distinguished from the men. These people, as well as their familiars, were occupied with attending of reverberatory furnaces and immense pear-shaped and gourd-shaped vessels, such as were used in alchemy. Some, also, were stooping above great fuming cauldrons, like sorcerers busy with the brewing of terrible drugs. Against the opposite wall there were two enormous vats, built of stone and mortar, whose circular sides rose higher than a man's head, so that Bernard and Stephan were unable to determine their contents. One of the vats gave forth a whitish glimmering, the other a ruddy luminosity. Near the vats, and somewhat between them, there stood a sort of low couch or litter made of luxurious, weirdly figured fabrics, such as the Saracens weave. On this the monks discerned a dwarfish being, pale and wizened, with eyes of chill flame that shone like evil beryls through the dusk. The dwarf, who had all the air of a feeble moribund, was supervising the toils of the men and their familiars. The dazed eyes of the brothers began to comprehend other details. They saw that several corpses, among which they recognized that of Theophile, were lying on the middle floor, together with a heap of human bones that had been wrenched asunder at the joints, and great lumps of human flesh piled like the carvings of butchers. One of the men was lifting the bones and dropping them into a cauldron beneath which there glowed a ruby-colored fire, and another was flinging the lumps of flesh into a tub filled with some hueless liquid that gave forth an evil hissing as of 1,000 serpents. Others had stripped the grave clothes from one of the cadavers, and were starting to assail it with long knives. Others still were mounting rude flights of stone stairs along the walls of the immense vats, carrying vessels filled with semi-liquescent matters, which they emptied over the high rims. Appalled at this vision of human and satanic turpitude, and feeling a more than righteous indignation, the monks resumed their chanting of sonorous exorcisms and rushed forward. Their entrance, it appeared, was not perceived by the heinously occupied crew of sorcerers and devils. Bernard and Stephan, filled with an ardor of godly wrath, were about to fling themselves upon the butchers who had started to assail the dead body. This corpse they recognized as being that of a notorious outlaw, named Jacques le Loup-garou, who had been slain a few days previous in combat with the officers of the state. Le Loup-garou, noted for his brawn, his cunning, and his ferocity, had long terrorized the woods and highways of Aveyron. His great body had been half eviscerated by the swords of the constabulary, and his beard was stiff and purple with the dried blood of a ghastly wound that had cloven his face from temple to mouth. He had died unshriven, but nevertheless the monks were unwilling to see his helpless cadaver put to some unhallowed use beyond the surmise of Christians. The pale, malignant-looking dwarf had now perceived the brothers. They heard him cry out in a shrill, imperatory tone that rose above the ominous hiss of the cauldrons and the hoarse mutter of men and demons. They knew not his words, which were those of some outlandish tongue, and sounded like an incantation. Instantly, as if in response to an order, two of the men turned from their unholy chemistry, and, lifting copper basins filled with an unknown fetid liquor, hurled the contents of these vessels in the faces of Bernard and Stephan. The brothers were blinded by the stinging fluid, which bit their flesh as with many serpents' teeth, and they were overcome by the noxious fumes, so that their great crosses dropped from their hands, and they both fell unconscious on the castle floor. Recovering anon their sight and their other senses, they found that their hands had been tied with heavy thongs of gut, so that they were now helpless, and could no longer wield their crucifixes or their sprinklers of holy water which they carried. In this ignominious condition, they heard the voice of the evil dwarf, commanding them to arise. They obeyed, though clumsily and with difficulty, being denied the assistance of their hands. Bernard, who was still sick with the poisonous vapor he had inhaled, fell twice before he succeeded in standing erect, and his discomfiture was greeted with the cachinnation of foul, obscene laughter from the assembled sorcerers. Now, standing, the monks were taunted by the dwarf, who mocked and reviled them with appalling blasphemies such as could be uttered only by a bondservant of Satan. At last, according to their sworn testimony, he said to them, "Return to your kennel, ye whelps of Ialdabaoth, and take with you this message. They that came here as many shall go forth as one." Then, in obedience to a dreadful formula spoken by the dwarf, 2 of the familiars, who had the shape of enormous and shadowy beasts, approached the body of le loup-garou and that of Brother Theophile. One of the foul demons, like a vapor that sinks into a marsh, entered the bloody nostrils of le loup-garou, disappearing inch by inch till its horned and bestial head was withdrawn from sight. The other, in like manner, went in through the nostrils of Brother Theophile, whose head lay wried athwart his shoulders on the broken neck. Then, when the demons had completed their possession, the bodies, in a fashion horrible to behold, were raised up from the castle floor, the one with ravelled entrails hanging from its wide wounds, the other with a head that drooped forward loosely on its bosom. Then, animated by their devils, the cadavers took up the crosses of hornbeam that had been dropped by Stefan and Bernard, and, using the crosses for bludgeons, they drove the monks in ignominious flight from the castle, amid a loud, tempestuous howling of infernal laughter from the dwarf and his necromantic crew. And the nude corpse of le loup-garou and the robed cadaver of Theophile followed them far on the chasm-riven slopes below Ylourgne, striking great blows with the crosses, so that the backs of the 2 Cistercians were become a mass of bloody bruises. After a defeat so signal and crushing, no more of the monks were emboldened to go up against Ylourgne. The whole monastery, thereafter, devoted itself to triple austerities, to quadrupled prayers, and awaiting the unknown will of God and the equally obscure machinations of the devil, maintained a pious faith that was somewhat tempered with trepidation. In time, through goatherds who visited the monks, the tale of Stefan and Bernard went forth through Aveyron, adding to the grievous alarm that had been caused by the wholesale disappearance of the dead. No one knew what was really going on in the haunted castle, or what disposition had been made of the hundreds of migratory corpses, but the light thrown on their fate by the monk's story, though lurid and frightful, was all too inconclusive, and the message sent by the dwarf was somewhat cabalistic. Everyone felt, however, that some gigantic menace, some black infernal enchantment, was being brewed within the ruinous walls. The malignant, moribund dwarf was all too readily identified with the missing sorcerer Neter, and his underlings, it was plain, were Neter's pupils.